It's right, there we go. Hello, everyone. Well, first and foremost, thank you for joining us for this conversation after viewers have watched the documentary. I will start off by just going through quick introductions. I'll go first, Kevin, you go, and then we'll end with you, Benjamin. So my name is Mzwa, I'm a member of the South African Film Selection Committee. And I do want to remind our audience that all funds generated here go towards the Education Without Borders initiative, which provides after-school programs for kids in townships in South Africa and provides programming for youth in First Nations communities here in Canada. And with that, I'll pass it to Kevin. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, Imzwa, and good evening, Benji. Nice to be with you again, especially to do with Robert Sobukwe. My name is Kevin Harris. I live in Johannesburg, South Africa, and I work from here. And I'm a local South African independent documentary filmmaker. Thank
you. I'm Benjamin Pogrund. I was born in Cape Town in South Africa. I spent 26 years on the Rand Daily Mail in Johannesburg, ending up as deputy editor, and the paper was finally closed down by the owners under pressure from the government because we were the most leading anti-apartheid voice. And I spent 10 years in Britain and America, and then a quarter century ago I came to Jerusalem to start a dialogue center here. We didn't bring about peace, unfortunately, so I rather unhappily sit in Jerusalem, Israel today, in a great mess at the moment.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you both. Kevin, let's start off with a question for you. We are curious just to understand the inspiration that came up in terms of you wanting to make this documentary about Robert Sobukwe's life and legacy.
Okay, well, before transformation, before 1990, before 1994, it was obviously impossible to make relevant films, relevant documentary films in South Africa about people like Robert Sobukwe or Nelson Mandela. So with the imminent transformation that was coming with the elections of 1994, I'd been curious about Robert Sobukwe and the PAC. And then, with transformation, with respect, everybody was clamoring around Nelson Mandela. All the filmmakers were clamoring to do stuff on Nelson Mandela. And I guess there were people that were better positioned than me, a lot better positioned, and particularly people from international people that had access to him, and they came in here and they kind of, took him, and a lot of films were made with Nelson Mandela, which is great. And I thought, Robert Sobukwe, here's a man that, people don't know much about. In fact, I don't know much about. And then I discovered Benji's book, which is called How Can Man Die Better? Robert Sobukwe and Apartheid. And I read that. And of course, that just inspired me totally, because it's the definitive biography of Robert Sobukwe, and it tells his life. And as Benjamin knew him and the family very intimately, and that was my starting point. And then I contacted Benji, and we met, and I presented my credentials, and he agreed that, he would work with me on the film. And goes way back, in fact, to 1996, because that was the film I was making in 1996, which was actually finally called Robert Sobukwe, A Tribute to Integrity, because that kind of summed it up for me. And I had gone to the SABC, which of course now was in transformation. There was the old apartheid regime had gone, and there was a commissioning editor, Pat Kelly. He was a great guy, and thanks to Pat, he agreed that yes, okay, let's just go about it quietly, because We don't want to like stand up and go rah rah, you know, this is the PAC or whatever. It's a film about Robert Sobukwe and you know, a man with integrity. So that's how I went about making the film, and of course working a lot with Benji. And so in 1996 I made a tribute, Sobukwe, a tribute to integrity, and then and that was broadcast on SABC, and it went down very well. And then 2011, 2012, the Nelson Mandela Foundation approached me because they wanted to celebrate Robert Sobukwe, or at least acknowledge him. And they then asked me if I would make a shorter film, which was the 24-minute film, which we called Remember Africa, Remember Sobukwe. And that is the film that you've seen, and that is the film that is on your festival.
Fantastic. I would be amiss not to take the opportunity to ask you, Benjamin, about the inspiration that came with putting together a book commemorating Robert's life.
Well, I'd been very close to him, and in the South Africa at the time, it was a quite extraordinary relationship between white and black. I mean, in those days, you couldn't travel in a cab together. We had difficulty visiting each other's homes. You couldn't get on a bus together. You couldn't have a meal together, couldn't have coffee together. So you had to work hard at being friends. And ours was, the first time we met was just a natural liking for each other. And as we got to know each other better, we got closer. And we ended up with what I can only say was an extraordinary friendship. And Kevin, with the title of that documentary he did, very fine documentary, the title really sums it all up. A man of integrity. That was Robert Sobukwe. And we'll go on to talk more details, but I think South Africa and the world owe a great service to Kevin Harris for having done that documentary when there were people still around who were able to talk about it and talk about him.
Beautifully put. Now, with the 100th anniversary of Sobukwe's birth right around the corner in December 2024, I wanted to ask you both if there are plans in your respective geographies or even anything you know about in South Africa or within the South African diaspora to commemorate Sobukwe's legacy.
Kevin?
Yes, I do know. I mean, I've been putting it out there. I've, in fact, put it out to international networks as well. People don't jump at documentaries. I guess you understand that. But here in South Africa, the Nelson Mandela Foundation is going to broadcast it in December near the commemoration date, and they'll do it as a commemoration for Robert Sobukwe. And that is so far what I've managed to do.
If I may pick up on that, the role of the Nelson Mandela Foundation is wonderful. And it's also unusual, and it says a lot of good about them, because Sobukwe and Mandela were very bitter political rivals. And there was a lot of anger on both sides towards the other. They met again in Robben Island, in Pretoria Prison. At one stage, they were both there at the same time, and they sat side by side on the concrete floor doing prisoners' work, which was sewing canvas mail bags, which I gather was a pretty awful thing because these are mail bags dragged all over the place. And they sat next to each other for a little while talking, and they talked politics. And when I saw Mandela in prison many years later, we spoke about them meeting in that time, and he said they'd had very good discussions, and had they been able to go on with them, they could have reached an accord. But the prison authorities realized that these two powerful people were sitting next to each other and getting on well, so they separated them after a while. So there was no further contact. But Mandela had a very good liking for Bob. They'd been in the youth league together, and they knew each other. Sobukwe told me, I said, what did you talk about? And he said, well, they had a big argument, who was the greatest writer in the English language? And one said Shakespeare, and I forgot the other one. There was Shakespeare, Bernard Shaw, that's right. And I can't remember who chose which, but one was Shakespeare, one was Bernard Shaw. And they had a vehement discussion about this, which tells you a lot also about the intellects.
That's fantastic. And it kind of segues into two questions I have, and I think these are quite related questions. The first piece is to try and explain for the Canadian audience the distinctions, the political distinctions and philosophical distinctions between the PAC and the ANC. And then to also talk about with Mandela's passing and the legacy of the ANC and for how long they've been in power in Free South Africa. Essentially, I want to tease out the question of, do you think the PAC has been given its dues for its impact to getting South Africa to a state of freedom?
I think Benji should take that.
Sorry, you go ahead, Kevin, please.
No, I'm saying I think Benji definitely take that.
Oh, see. No, they've been wiped out of history. They've been if I may use the phrase, whitewashed out of history, because even Sharpeville, which was a massacre of scores of people, which was a PAC event, and it's observed every year in Human Rights Day in South Africa, which is a worldwide celebration or commemoration. Even that, if you read what happens on Human Rights Day, the ANC pretends that it was responsible, or it was Sharpeville. PAC is not mentioned. So they've been played right out of the scene, and Sobukwe equally so. But his legacy has endured despite that, because it was so strong. But in formal terms, and the trouble is, the PAC only lasted 1 year, and it destroyed itself because its leaders took the bold, courageous decision to offer themselves to prison. And that was Sobukwe's lead. He said, I will not ask anyone to do what I myself will not do. And the call on March 21, 1960 to Black people was to go to the nearest police station without their pass, which was a little reference book which controlled their lives, and to demand they be arrested. And he said, I will go first. And virtually the whole PAC executive went with him. It meant overnight the leadership was locked up. I was keeping in touch with Sobukwe in prison at that time as a journalist outside through a man who was the office cleaner, and he had taken over the PAC. It was that bad. So they destroyed themselves, and then those who went into exile, there were a couple of executive members who were sent into exile. A most terrible person, Potlaka Labalo, took over, and he destroyed the PAC. It became a bunch of corrupt murderers, robbers, terrible people, and I'm afraid it's just never recovered. If I remember correctly, it gets less than 1% in elections now. In the last election recently, it got, again, 1 seat in parliament, and that's a tragedy. So the ideas live on. You know, when I go to South Africa, and I go when I can, among the younger people, I'm also always astonished and angry when I say, do you know Sobukwe? And they look at me blankly. You know,
I'm guilty of that.
The same with Mandela. This is worldwide, ignorance among the young. But they look at me blankly, and then I get angry with him. I said, you go home and Google the name Robert Sobukwe, and then you go and buy my book, and you'll find out more about your heritage. But among the older people in the elite, there's a very strong Africanist belief, and you come across that all the time. So the name lives on. As a political party, it barely exists, and but as an idea, Pan-Africanism is very important.
That's really well put. And I must confess to my own ignorance. I know of the Steve Bikos and the Sisulus and the Mandelas, of course, but I think I'd only heard of Robert's name in passing. And this documentary, for me, as someone of South African heritage, it was an education.
Well, I can tell you say Biko, who was a wonderful, gifted leader and was killed by the security police. He said at one time they were somewhere and Sobukwe walked into the room, and Biko got up and he said, God has walked into the room. He was very much a follower, a student of Sobukwe's. In fact, I believe that while he was banned, which meant he was restricted to a particular area, he couldn't be with more than one person at a time, that sort of thing. He
The
traveled.
Sobukwe clause? Are you referring to the Sobukwe clause?
To the general banning, hundreds of people were banned. But Biko, to my knowledge, made it at least one totally illegal trip through the night to Kimberley, where Sobukwe was banished and not allowed to meet banned people. But Steve went through the night for a meeting with Sobukwe. And I know of at least one meeting that happened there.
Oh, that might be a first. I'm not sure if this has been captured or highlighted over these interactions because, yeah, it's very clear that Robert led a very rich life. We touched upon this a little bit, but during his time in imprisonment and in isolation, and in particular solitary confinement, Benjamin, if you have any ideas about how he went and managed himself during that time to come out still very focused on his beliefs and the future he wanted to see in South Africa, I would love for you to speak a little bit about that.
I'm sorry, it's a very sad story. But I've written about it. I thought a lot about it and decided I had to tell the truth. I was working on a PhD about African nationalism, and that was the cover for my applying to see him on Robben Island in the first year. And I was given permission. I saw him 6 times, and we had no illusions. They gave me permission to see him because they wanted to know what he was thinking. There was no person treated more cruelly than him. He was locked into solitary for 6 years, and they were scared of him. A special law of Parliament was passed to put him into solitary confinement, and it was renewed every year. And the Justice Minister said he'd be in prison from here to eternity. So you never knew when he was going to be released. Each year it was renewed. But we sat in this little room. We were close enough. We knew what was going on. We knew that they were listening to us. The microphone was probably in the ceiling above us. And my admiration for him then was total, because he knew they were listening to us. He knew they wanted to know what he was going to do. And he said emphatically, the day he came out of prison, he would resume opposition resistance again. I sat there looking at him and listening to him and knowing he was dooming himself to solitary confinement. And he did it knowing what he was doing. And that's in fact what happened. They simply, after that, the treatment of him deteriorated. They virtually threw the key away and didn't bother about him. But what happened was, each year we waited to see if they were going to renew the solitary confinement. They did, but there was that uncertainty. He had some visitors. His wife and children were allowed to see him. Distinguished visitors from abroad, a few. Helen Suzman, the Member of Parliament. Otherwise, no one could speak to him. His food was brought in by a prisoner accompanied by a warder who had instructions not to say a word to him. He was kept in total silence. And that, I'm afraid, had an effect. You were in solitary confinement and locked up like that. After 6 years, he started showing signs of mental problems. There's no question about it. And they panicked. They absolutely panicked, and they got him out of prison quick as a flash and banished him to the town of Kimberley, where he was totally unknown. He didn't know the local language or anything like that. And that's what they did to him. And he was there 6 years, and he died of cancer there. And and I held the government responsible for that because of his bannings and security police delays and so on. It took some time for me to be able to arrange for him to see a decent doctor in Johannesburg. And by that stage, the lung cancer had progressed so far that they operated on him, but it was too late. It was too advanced. It's a terrible story.
Thank you for that honesty. I often find it is very difficult, especially for someone who, in the documentary, we hear Zodwa Sobukwe's wife say that you and Bob were as close as brothers. To be to ask you to relive that is painful, but I also do think it's important for us to record it and share the truth and the honesty of it with our audience members. So thank
If I
you.
just add a PS, those mental problems did not stop. They stopped, basically. They did not impede him. He became a lawyer in Kimberley and ran a very good practice. He recovered. That's the point.
Yes, and I think that comes out really beautifully in the documentary when folks over in Kimberley speak very, I mean, in a very proud way about the effect Robert had in that community after his time in Robben Island. Benjamin, I do want to, you've lived a long life, and clearly you continue to uphold Robert's legacy and share it with the world. I would like to just, in a more direct manner, what's been the legacy of your friendship with Robert, and how has it influenced and shaped your life and your work?
Well, the only negativity was, as Kevin will remember from those days, Mandela was also my friend. I was the first non-family person allowed to visit him in prison. He asked to see me after, about 22, 23 years. And I was in touch with him from time to time. But to mention Mandela or Sobukwe's name in polite white company, you were viewed as a terrorist. People were afraid of you. And I was subject to a lot of ostracism in South Africa because of my friendships with Mandela and Sobukwe. But that was and I couldn't have given a damn about it anyway. But otherwise, nothing negative at all about it. He enriched my life incredibly. This amazing man, and when we first met, when he was a lecturer at Witwatersrand University in Zulu, but in those days they wouldn't appoint a black guy as a lecturer. He was called a language assistant, rather lesser thing. And from the first moment we met, there was just an instant friendship. And we became very close very soon. And then I wrote about it, so I can say it. I'm ashamed it's still the memory. When Sharpeville happened, I was there, and I nearly got murdered by an angry crowd, a mob, after the shooting of scores of people. And I was very lucky to escape with my life. And I was very shaken by that. And to my shame, I didn't go to Sobukwe's trial. I just couldn't face it. And only a bit later, I wrote to him in prison, and he replied immediately and asked me to visit him. And that's when our relationship really began to deepen, because his family needed looking after. When he was moved to Robben Island, he needed things. And the amazing thing was, although I was very much a target for government attack at that time, they did not disrupt our contact. But writing letters, they would hold on to letters 3-4 weeks. And then sometimes they just not send a letter. And I was dealing with all these affairs. And it might take me 6 months to suddenly realize he'd said something and I didn't know what it was, or I'd said something to him and didn't know what it was. This was a cruelty which added to his isolation. But writing a letter to him was a terribly hard thing. I'd sit and agonized because it was going to be seen by censors, people I didn't know. I had no idea what their rules were. So you had to try and write letters which I was trying to scratch his brain to keep him going, make him think. And I was looking after his affairs. And I had these unseen, sinister people there. So I'd write every word carefully, just so it wouldn't upset anyone. So a lot of the letters were very bland. I'd write about razor blades, quality of razor blades I was sending him, all sorts of mad stuff like that, just to try and keep a conversation going. Yet a remarkable amount did come through. The letters have been published in a book, and it is remarkable how much they did let through. But so much, it was just a hard thing to keep going. But we did it, and we emerged stronger for it.
Yeah, I'm always humbled to recognize the forces and people like you and Robert and the many, many generations of South Africans that worked very hard to transform the country. You know, and to folks like you, Kevin, who continue to put together these, how best to put them, they are like historical tomes that generations of South Africans will reference because these stories have been captured in film. And I just think there's a certain and beautiful longevity that comes out of that process. And that brings me to my last question, which is thinking about Sobukwe's legacy. I'm curious to get reflections from you both about what lessons do you think modern South Africa should take from this man's life? And also, why is it important for the youth of South Africa to learn about Sobukwe and his contributions to the transformation of South Africa?
Kevin, you want to go first?
Thank you. Yeah, it's an important question because I think what I do feel very strongly about is the betrayal that has been affected by, sure, I would say generally the leadership that has emerged since democracy in South Africa. It's an absolute disgrace. And it's a betrayal to people like Robert Sobukwe. It's a betrayal to all those people that sacrificed their lives, those people that died, that sacrificed their families. And there are many, there are thousands that we don't know about that lost their lives and ended up buried in a ditch somewhere. All those people, what this leadership generation has done since democracy is an absolute betrayal of the vision that we all had for a post-apartheid South Africa. And they have betrayed that vision, and they betrayed all the people that sacrificed to try and achieve that vision. So it is essential that young people just rethink, where we are, where we're going, this whole thing of entitlement. And what I come to in terms of Sobukwe, and it goes back to that original title, A Tribute to Integrity, and it's in the film as well, but I'd like to emphasize, because again, it points to what the biggest issue that we have in South Africa is one about lack of leadership. If I may just say, since Desmond Tutu has passed on, there is no more the voice of moral authority that stands up the moment something terrible happens and says, that is wrong. Nobody does that. Robert Sobukwe once said, true leadership demands complete subjugation of self, absolute honesty, integrity, and uprightness of character, courage and fearlessness, and above all, a consuming love for one's people. That was Sobukwe's vision, and that embodied the vision that we all had for this post-apartheid South Africa. And that's why it's important that young people should know about Robert Sobukwe.
I agree fully with what Kevin says. And that's where Sobukwe is needed today, his views, the integrity, the honesty, the commitment to good, the lack of corruption, because the ANC has made a total mess of the country. And yet Sobukwe's example lives on. And that's why he's so even more important today. If I can just round off by pick up on one thing you said earlier. I was a journalist in South Africa for 26 years. And I started off a young reporter after being at university, and I focused on reporting black politics, which was unknown in the white press at that time. And I went on over the years. I was finally deputy editor of the Rand Daily Mail. And I wrote heaven knows how many exposés of apartheid evils, how many editorials I wrote attacking apartheid and what they were doing. And at the end, I reached the sad conclusion that I was a walking, talking, living example of the failure of the written word to achieve anything. That was my dire summation of my life there. On the other hand, when I look back in my better moments, I can see that we were drops of water, and thoughts were circulating in society. The things we were calling for is what the ANC basically started off doing, when they first began, before they went rotten. So perhaps there was a purpose to it after all, and Kevin's work certainly exemplifies that.
That is really beautifully put. I will end it there. I want to thank you both for spending this time with me. It's an honor to meet you both and to have this conversation. And I am very touched just by the frankness of it. And again, I cannot put into words, but I've really been inspired to see this example of Sobukwe's life. Like it is transformational to know and to see and to witness what he meant. And I really hope more people will get to see his work and read your book, Benjamin.
Thank you.
Thank you.